Okay, so again, welcome everyone. And I want to especially welcome our presenter tonight, Eric Fisher. Uh, Eric Fisher, you may remember him from a program that we did in 2013. The library did a big read program where we read and discussed and did programs around In the Time of the Butterflies. Eric generously did a program for us on the baseball in the Dominican Republic. He is now the US editor for a UK publication called Sport Business Group, where they cover the business of sports, all the off-field stuff. He's been doing that for the last year. Before that, he spent 15 years with Sports Business Journal, a company based in New York. So he worked there. Before that, he spent several years working for the Washington Times as a sports business writer. He covered the relocation, among many other things. He covered the relocation of the Montreal Expos to what are now the Washington Nationals. It took a lot out of him, and I know because he's my husband, and so we kind of went through it together. So he was a pretty easy get for this evening. And when we planned this program, I thought, well, what happens if by the middle of June, everybody's got their stuff in play and there's no new news? There's new news about baseball even tonight. So it should be a really great program. So Eric, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you all, everybody, for joining in here. It's really been an unusual few months here. You know, I've been doing this for 25 years now. I've never seen anything like this, but really if you go back through the history of all the sports, particularly baseball and some of the older ones that go back 150 plus years, there's never been anything like what we've seen in the last 90 days. We've had wars, we've had hurricanes, we've had 9/11, we've had earthquakes, you name it, and there's been brief stoppages of play here and there in various leagues, 10 days, 2 weeks, what have you, but to shut down the entire industry on a global level and only now have it reemerge, it's really been unprecedented just by the nature of the virus and how it reacts and how it has to be managed, and much like what we're dealing with in our everyday lives. But there's some particular instances or particular attributes of each of these respective sports that make it so much more complicated. First and foremost, of course, being that there are a few other things in our society that gathers us in these kind of numbers, you know, an 18,000 seat arena, 70,000 seat stadium. There's not many things that gather us in those kind of numbers, and that creates all the inherent risk of how the virus is going to behave. But even playing without fans, and I'll get into a lot of that as we go through sort of league by league, even without that, and a lot of sports have already started to come back without attending fans, there's still a lot of health and safety protocols that have to be managed with just the participants, and not only the athletes, but the coaches, arena personnel, all of those kinds of things. So it's really been a complicated thing, and each individual league has been sort of going through each of their sort of own pathways, sort of trying to take notes from each other and best practices, but ultimately there are going to be individual attributes on each based on where they are in their respective calendars, how their sport performs, the kind of social distancing that their particular sport lends to. Some things lend themselves really well, like NASCAR. Others are much more complicated when there's a lot of skin-on-skin contact, your combat sports, your basketball, those kinds of things. So that's where you see a lot of the differentiation start to come in. So again, these last 90 days, as Mary Beth can attest, and you know, some of the crazy hours that I've been working trying to chronicle all of this, it's been a really, really fast-moving target with new stuff coming pretty much every day. So what I'd like to probably do over maybe the next 20 minutes or so is within that sort of broad framework and the kind of challenges that the entire sports industry is dealing with, sort of go through kind of sport by sport, where they're at, what their kind of timetables are, and the kinds of things that they're thinking about in terms of getting back to play. I'm assuming a lot of you are big baseball fans. As you can see, I'm a big baseball fan as well. I'm going to save that one to the end because it's really the most complicated and and there's stuff happening literally this evening, as Mary Beth alluded to. And since they're the ones really furthest behind in terms of actually getting back to play anyway, it's probably good to save that one to the end. And then I really do want to hear your questions and try to respond to what's on your mind as well. So first off, you guys are all on mute, but I'll sort of start with a trivia question. I'll already sort of answer for you that if you want to sort of win a bar bet or next time you're at a barbecue or whatever your socially distanced gathering is, the major U.S. pro sports property that actually got back going first, coming off of when everything shut down in March, the first one to actually come back was professional bull riders. You may not have known that, and that's, again, it's a great bar trivia kind of game, but they were able to come back for a couple of particular reasons that it's just a guy riding on a bull, and it was very easy to socially distance that kind of competition, no attending fans, and they found an arena to start play in the middle of nowhere in rural Oklahoma, again, just given the nature of the sport, that they didn't need to be in some metro area, even though PBR does play in a metro area. They were actually able to get going in late April, and they've actually been in a weird sort of way, sort of an influencer upon a lot of the other much bigger properties in terms of the kinds of things that they did, quarantining the athletes, cleaning everything that in an arena that was being touched, and all of those sanitization protocols. Those notes were ultimately taken to a lot of the other properties. So again, PBR was really the first to get going and was an influencer. Coming off of that, the next one I want to sort of get into for a couple of minutes here is NASCAR, because they've been up and going for a month now. Started in Darlington in South Carolina a month ago, or 4 weeks ago now. And they started with no fans, but they're actually now starting to do limited fans. They've done so well, again, with these health and safety protocols, and they're actually able to sort of move to what I would call sort of a phase 2 of live competition and doing it with limited fans. And really where they've been able to do is not only having good health and safety protocols, but the nature of the sport itself. Again, they've got an inherent advantage where the driver, it's a solo guy in a car by himself, and they're wearing the helmet and everything, and there's no chance of them coming and spitting on them, breathing on them, any of that sort of thing. So really kind of a virus friendly sport, as it were. Having said all of that, still not letting a full facility full of fans in at this point, trying to get to that point towards the end of the season in the fall. But right now NASCAR, they're doing that limited fans, but they've been able to sort of really get going. And it almost sort of feels for them like a normal schedule, because they've done some midweek races to try to make up some events that were from March and April that were canceled after Daytona. They did get Daytona in February. But now we're sort of getting into a weekly rhythm with them. And it almost sort of feels like, to a certain extent, almost like nothing happened. Golf is getting there. They're not that far behind. Many of you may have seen the whole Tiger Phil competition, the sequel of the match over Memorial Day weekend with Peyton Manning and Tom Brady. That was another event held without fans, socially distanced, a number of rules in turn. They were driving their own carts and those kinds of things. And we just had our first PGA Tour event, Charles Schwab Classic, this past weekend. Same sort of thing. No fans, socially distanced, a lot of rules in terms of where the players could go, where the caddies could go, limited amount of technical and operational personnel on course. And this is going to be their way going forward. Again, nature of the sport lends itself to social distancing. So that's another one where they were able to sort of get going, and it's starting to feel kind of like a normal schedule again. But what they've had to do is completely upend their entire calendar. And I made a reference before about each of these sports having to figure out how to rearrange the chess pieces in their respective calendars. The case with golf, this is like prime time right now for all these majors. We didn't have the Masters in April for obvious reasons. Didn't have the U.S. We're not going to have the U.S. Open this coming weekend, and all of these events have been sort of pushed later in the calendar and later in 2020, and it's going to create a sort of a new cadence to the season. But they're going to try to get these events in and see where they land. But so far so good with golf as well. And they're another one that's sort of out front compared to the what we call the big four with the team sports, baseball, football, basketball, and hockey. And I'll get to each of those as we go along here. Just a brief word about tennis. Tennis pretty similar to golf, although they haven't started yet, but same sort of thing where socially distant, friendly sport. And they're now getting into the heart of their majors as well. We're not going to have Wimbledon this year. That was an unfortunate loss to COVID. No 2020 Wimbledon. French Open is going to be in the fall, late September into October. The big thing going on right now for us local fans here is what's going to happen with the U.S. Open. The idea is to still have it in Queens in that late August, early September timeframe, as they usually do. But tennis is such an international sport, and the vast majority of the players on both the men's and women's circuits are non-American. So that creates a lot of additional immigration challenges in terms of coming into this country, having the requisite quarantining provisions and so forth. So there are a number of prominent players, Novak Djokovic being most vocal among them, that are like, we're not sure if the protocols the U.S. Open is set up, particularly to deal with the immigration issues that these international players have had, if that's going to be sufficient. So we're still a little bit, unfortunately, in some limbo as to whether the tennis U.S. Open is going to happen. It's going to be something to really bear watching over the next few weeks. And even if it does happen, what's going to happen with the fan attendance? The organizers would really like to have it. It is by far the loudest and most raucous of the tennis majors, very much sort of the antithesis of the more sort of stately and proper Wimbledon. And not having that fan energy, they feel like will really degrade from the atmosphere of the event. And they're hoping by 2 months from now, they're in a place where they can have most or all their fans in place there. But we're going to just have to see how that all plays out. There's a lot of moving pieces on that, because not only are all of those immigration issues with the federal government needing to be worked out, but because that's within the city of New York and obviously how hard hit the city has been, they've got to basically work it out with de Blasio and his staff, and also Cuomo and his staff. And then you get into all the mural political issues within New York that you guys all know about. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but it's a complicated event because there's a lot of sort of hands in the cookie jar, so to speak. But it's a big deal, not only for the sports industry at large, but for us here locally. So that's one I'm really sort of paying a lot of attention to see how that plays out. The Olympics. This was another big thing that came out as COVID really sort of reared its head. As most of you know, we've had a full year's delay in the 2020 Summer Olympics that were going to be in Tokyo this year. And so they debated a lot of different timetables as to where that was going to land. Should they do it in the fall? Should they do it in the winter? Should they try springtime? But where they landed was essentially the exact same dates of late July into August, and just make it 2021 instead of 2020. And that's, given all the other obstacles, was really the best choice. But the problem is that was not a consequence-free choice. Just on a financial basis, it's the best estimates we've seen, it's about $3 billion in cost to basically move all of these various components, because the Olympics are such a huge event. So they're already talking about, because of those additional cost burdens of having to do all the rescheduling, that a lot of the sort of pageantry and some of the additional sort of fluff, for lack of a better phrase, of the Olympics are probably going to be scaled down. And they're talking about literally sort of having a smaller, almost more austere Olympics. So the competitions will still happen, but maybe some of the additional pageantry will not be there and what we've sort of been used to in prior Olympics. And that's just given the additional cost burden that they've had to take on. The other piece of that is all of the individual sport championships, not only the national championships here, but in all the other countries that feed into the Olympics in terms of qualifiers, track and field, swimming, you name it. They're all governed on a certain calendar that sort of feeds into the Olympics, and they have all of their individual events, national championships, regional qualifiers, local qualifiers, all the way down the ladder in each of the individual sports. All of that had to be rescheduled. So incredibly complicated. And so it's really going to take 2 to 3 years for a lot of these sports to kind of smooth out their calendar because, again, there's a domino effect and all of this. So it's really going to be like 2022 for a lot of these sports where you get back into certain things happening in a respective sport at the time of year where they usually do. So from an organization standpoint, really, really complicated. But at this point, there's nobody wants to cancel the Olympics. Again, we've rescheduled. There's going to be some reshaping of the event, but nobody wants to cancel. And the only way that we would have a cancellation at this point is if we really get to a kind of full-blown global situation where the numbers all over the world are like they were in February and March. The good news from a global perspective, as many of you have seen, outside of the United States, a lot of the numbers in other parts of the world are really trending in a positive direction. We're just in a slightly different standpoint here, of course, here in the US. So the Olympics, again, a really complicated thing, but all systems at this point are still go for Tokyo next summer. Combat sports. So that's boxing and mixed martial arts like UFC and some of the other smaller mixed martial arts properties. They're all beginning to come back as well. Boxing had its first Las Vegas event in 3 months last week that appeared to come off well. Same sort of thing as like what I've talked about with some of the other properties where very limited staff on site, no fans, daily testing of all the athletes, symptom checks on everybody, support personnel and everybody on a daily basis and so forth. This is one I was kind of a little unsure about as to how that was going to happen, just given just how much bodily fluid and sweat and blood and everything else, just the nature of the combat and the inherent violence of those sports. For the most part, so far, so good. UFC, when they first came back in late April, during some initial qualifying for one of their first events back, there was one lower level fighter that tested positive as well as his trainer, but that appeared to have been sort of carried in prior to the event. They were immediately removed. There was no further incidents, and UFC has had a couple of events since then with no problem, and they are now getting more aggressive in their rescheduling, and they actually have 4 events in July in Abu Dhabi at this island that they've now sort of temporarily renamed Fight Island, where they're really trying to, again, accelerate the cadence of their events and sort of make up for lost time when they weren't able to do anything during March and the first part of April. But combat sports is actually moving right along and not too dissimilar to the kind of frequency and the kind of protocols the golf and tennis are doing. So now on to the team sports. NBA is kind of the furthest along. They got most of their regular season in before they shut down. They were actually the first of the major U.S. properties to shut down on March 11th. They actually had one of their players, a center in Utah named Rudy Gobert, actually tested positive, and that was sort of the domino. They immediately suspended the entire league, and then all the other major U.S. pro sports properties sort of fell in line. And they've really taken the 3 months since then to try to figure out, again, much like I talked about at the start, how they were going to come back, how they're going to be safe, and what the plan to do that was going to be. Where they've now landed is the owners have approved a plan where they would send 22 of the 30 teams, basically everybody that was in playoff contention at the time of their suspension of play, and anybody who was sort of hovering around those last playoff spots. All of those teams have now been invited to Orlando in sort of what I'm calling a bubble model, where players, coaches, support personnel, and officials are all sort of quarantined in Orlando on Disney property at the ESPN Wild World of Sports. And they're essentially going to be there from the middle of July until the middle of October, where they play the duration of their schedule. They're going to do a sort of an amended end to the regular season to do some playoff seeding, and then they're going to move into their normal playoffs. And they're sort of moving on that bubble model. The owners have approved this. They're fairly close in sort of ratifying the last pieces of this with the National Basketball Players Association, the Players Union. There is a dissident group of players who believe that they haven't done enough on the health and safety stuff, and maybe it's not such a good idea to be playing basketball right now, and we could be doing more to raise awareness around social justice issues. And so there's some debate going on around that for those various reasons. But I think ultimately the deal is going to finally get done, and we're going to see the basketball players go to training camp within a few weeks here, and then move towards right at the very end of July, start playing games again. So I think that will ultimately get over the finish line. And that model is now actually essentially the blueprint for what the WNBA and the National Hockey League are doing. The WNBA, the Women's League, which is essentially a sister operation of the NBA, they're basically doing the same thing. They were supposed to be playing now already. They're ostensibly a summertime league, but they're going to start next month as well with an amended, abbreviated regular season. And the same idea, they're going to be playing at the IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida. Same idea, same quarantine model, where basically the players, their families, if they want to bring them, and all the coaches and support personnel, they go to that site and they live there for the duration of that season. And a lot of that was both of those instances were driven by Florida until recently being better on the caseload for COVID. The governor, Ron DeSantis, being much more sort of open and permissive about, hey, sports, come on and do this. ESPN is a Disney or a tight media partner of the NBA and the WNBA, and they have these facilities that you go to the Wide World of Sports, multiple courts, multiple training facilities, multiple housing options in the hotels and the resorts and so forth for players. So it's really kind of one-stop shopping, that if you have to do this bubble model with the quarantining, you can literally do everything in that one site. National Hockey League really doing the same sort, essentially a modified flavor of that. The same sort of thing. They were almost done with their regular season as well. They are looking to have a 24-team playoff situation where, again, they do some seeding games and then move into a normal postseason. They want to do this in what they're calling 2 hub cities, and they have a list of 10 cities, 7 in the United States, 3 in Canada. It looks like Las Vegas is going to be one of those hub cities that would literally have half of this playoff situation, and essentially the same sort of bubble, what I'm describing with Orlando and Bradenton and basketball. And then there's a number of other candidates for the other half of the National Hockey League playoffs. Big complicating factor on this whole thing is where Canada lands on all of this. Obviously, National Hockey League has a big Canadian presence there. They got 7 teams up there. And a lot of the players come from there. And what's going to happen in terms of, by the time they actually intend to go to training camps next month, are players going to be able to get through their quarantining provisions? Where's Canada going to be on their immigration issues? Right now, the border's still essentially closed. So it's sort of a moving target on that. But if the Canada thing doesn't work out, the idea is to give the players enough lead time to get into the United States and then just do both of those hub cities in the United States, where it could be Vegas and Los Angeles, or Vegas and there's a few options on the East Coast. So we'll see how that plays out. So there's a few loose ends to carry out there, but it's the same basic idea operationally as what basketball is trying to do to get going again. Football is been the least affected. When this whole thing hit, they were in their off season. Super Bowl was already done. We won't have any sort of preseason games or training camp until later in the summer here. So they really haven't lost anything yet. But obviously they've got to be very mindful of this, just like everybody else. They did their draft, albeit in a modified virtual format, but the draft still carried out at its normal length. They released a schedule. Right now, the plan is to play National Football League games on the normal schedule. Where we're going to be on terms of attending fans really remains to be seen. That's sort of the big X factor on that one. We could have a situation, again, depending on how this advances over the next handful of weeks, that it really could vary market by market. The idea is for these teams to play in their respective markets, where you could have a situation where the Cowboys and the Giants play in Dallas, and Texas is allowing 50% capacity, and you could have a half-full AT&T Stadium. But when they come and play the return game at MetLife, if New Jersey's not allowing anything yet, you could have a situation there with no fans, and everything in between, depending on the other market. So a lot's going to be filled in there over the next 4 to 6 weeks. But right now, the idea is for the National Football League to sort of press forward. College football is kind of the same thing. We could have some attendance variances based on individual schools, state, and what the local provisions are. The big X factor with college football, though, is thankfully the NCAA has been very clear that college football is not going to be divorced from the campus situation. So, just to throw Michigan out as an example, if the University of Michigan is not having students on campus to take class, there's not going to be Michigan football. So we're, again, a lot of moving parts right now, but it seems that like a lot of schools, a flavor of the model that I've heard is students going back in the fall, some modified classroom adjustments, maybe staggered arrivals depending on which year the students are, and a lot of schools just packing it in at Thanksgiving time, and you don't necessarily come back in December for finals for those schools that are on a traditional semester format. But my point here is that the NCAA is tying the athletics to the student-athlete part of that, thankfully. In high schools, very much the same sort of situation. And we just had some news today that state of New Jersey here, they're beginning a phased-in approach on scholastic athletics, and varying it, again, based on the sport and the nature of the sport as to how far you can go. So like golf and tennis, they can do competitions now. Football, you're not going to start practices you can do some light group workout now, workout type of stuff now, but competitions not until much later. Full practices not until later. So they've sort of staggered it, again, based on the inherent risk of the sport itself and what the risk is for potential transmission. So covered a lot of sports there. Baseball, just a hot mess right now. Basically, they're kind of nowhere right now. And not only are they trying to solve for all of the health and safety provisions, and there's some particular attributes for their sport because they play every day and the players are at the ballpark 12, 14 hours a day in season, that they're showing up in the afternoon for an evening game. They're showing up in the afternoon. They're doing workouts, BP, the game itself, post-game responsibilities. It's a very long day. And when you're in that environment, both indoors and outdoor components, it's pretty complicated on that standpoint. But the fundamental issue that's really been grappling, particularly over the last 2 weeks, is just where they're going to land on the money situation. The players are insistent that they should be receiving their prorated shares of their guaranteed 2020 contract. So if they were to play an 81-game season, although they probably won't get that many games in at this point, but just for purposes of the math, if they were to play 81 games, they should be receiving half of their original contracts. What the owners are trying to get is not only the prorated based on whatever the number of games divided by 162, but further concessions on top of that. And this is where the players are really balking. And it's just been a really ugly back and forth where the owners are like, well, listen, we're not having any attending fans, at least to start. There's a big revenue hit here. But the players' very clear rejoinder, and I think well-founded, is our contracts are not tied to attendance. That, in a normal season, based on how many people go through the turnstiles, it may ultimately have an indirect tie in terms of the willingness of the owner to sign that next contract for X amount. But there's never any direct tie in that player contract in terms of you have to have X many fans to get this much money. It's never been done in that sport, and that's what the owners are now essentially attempting. And this is why we've got such a bitter divide. And where the news is literally just today, the commissioner of baseball, Rob Manfred, even though just last Wednesday he said there was a 100% chance that we would have some version of a 2020 season, he is now saying they don't know if there's going to be a 2020 season because, the players union is basically like, just tell us where to show up and how many games there are. And they're just sort of essentially broken off negotiations because where they made sort of a side deal, there's the master collective bargaining agreement, but in March, as the pandemic was starting to unfold, because they were about to start the season, they had to deal with some particularly urgent issues, and they created sort of a side deal to try to deal with some of these issues. And foremost among them, there were a few key components in that deal. Number one, that there was going to be some modicum of payment, essentially like a 2% payment on the original contracts that the players would get regardless if there was a season or not. So there would at least be some money coming into those players so they can continue to pay their own bills. They would still get a year of service time regardless of what happened. And there was also a provision in there that failing all else, if the sides could not agree on the length and terms of an amended 2020 regular season, the commissioner has the power to just unilaterally, it's going to be 50 games, 54 games, whatever the number is. He can just set the number so long as he pays 100% of the prorated contract. So long as he honors those original terms, he can just set the number. But what he's been trying to do is set a different number at a different rate. And it's just caused a huge problem. And it just feeds into what is literally decades of mistrust, that even though the last 3 master agreements between the players and the owners have gone better, they've essentially been fighting a 50-year fight with 8 work stoppages and just all sorts of historical distrust, which are all now really feeding into the current situation. So it was a bad situation before, and I'm, really getting pessimistic now as to what's going to happen, because even if they were to play, what's happening is all of the other sports are just lapping beyond them in terms of sort of public perception, public affection, what's going to happen, because all the other leagues are going to start playing again, and they're going to try to sort of say and do a lot of the right things in terms of raising awareness for causes, honoring first responders, all those kinds of things, and using their platforms to do greater societal good. And baseball's just still kind of stuck in the mud trying to figure out how, where, and when to play. So that's really been dominating a lot of my time, particularly over the last couple of weeks, and will continue to do so, because this thing is going to it's going to, even if they play some semblance of a season this year, there's inevitably going to be a labor grievance, maybe cross-directional labor grievances, and then it's going to feed into what they were already to do to have another master collective bargaining agreement session next year. So this is really just the beginning of probably about 18 months of angst on that whole situation. So a lot more, unfortunately, to come on that point. So that's just a very sort of quick and dirty on where each of the leagues are. Again, everybody's sort of moving in a slightly different place, but all still trying to get to the same place where they can play safely, do it in the right way, try to get back to some semblance of their normal calendars and pay the bills. A lot of hard things to do all at once. And again, situation unlike anything we've ever seen, but it's been crazy times indeed. So I'd love to hear your questions.
I have a question about the contact sports. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So many of the sports you can readily socially distance, but in sports like football and basketball, I mean, the players are going to be in there dressing with their teammates, scrimmaging, mixing it up. Are they planning to just have these players literally see nobody but their teammates for the duration of the season, or will they be tested every week? Or how do they know that one person isn't going to affect the league?
Basically the idea is to do testing in most of these instances every day. So literally get baselines and keep all that data on a day-to-day basis. So, and again, it's going to vary slightly sport to sport, but literally have daily testing, daily symptom checks. So as soon, because there's inevitably what you're really getting at, and I'm glad you brought this up because I really didn't get there. In each of these situations, and particularly the major team sports, there's inevitably going to be positives. And what they were trying to do is have a situation as they come back to play is take that player, because they've now have all this data they can contact trace very easily because they're in the bubbles, they know exactly where they've been, and just literally take him out of competition, and then just the rest of the team can move on because they're continuing to be tested, and all that contact tracing, all that data is fresh and it's being constantly updated. So that inevitably there's going to be some positives. You just literally excise them out and you keep playing.
Thank you.
A lot of resources. And there was some concern about this, particularly back in March and April, like should the leagues be using so many of these tests that should be going to the medical care system. But what's been happening over the last 7-8 weeks is, as the numbers have gone down, as hospitals have gotten a lot better about treating this, that supply issue is kind of abated, and it's gotten to a point where the consumption of those resources is not the same sort of concern as it was, particularly in mid to late March when things are really hot and heavy on this front.
I got that. Good. I have one follow-up question on that, and that is that all seems to make sense for professional sports with the immense resources they have to test and track. But now you start talking about bringing the colleges back, and the small colleges and even the high schools that don't have the resources to test and their players are not in a bubble. They're going to be out in their community every single day. I really don't see how that's going to work. I guess, are they just going to wing it and see how it goes and go from there? Or
yeah, I have some real concerns too, and this is something that Mary Beth and I have been talking about as band parents, because we've been involved in our local marching band for so many years that sort of piggybacks on the football team in some fashion, and they have their own sort of schedule. And not only that, they're sort of the brass instruments, particularly with the blowing and expectoration going through the instruments and so forth. Your point is very well taken, that we at this level here, and just knowing, having been around the band and having been around our high school football team, they don't have those kind of resources that I just described to do all of that contact tracing and that level of testing. So as we sit here on June 15th, we just don't really know. And again, the state has put out sort of this loose framework as to sort of the step progression for some of these various sports, but executing that, to your point, is a very different story. And we're going to have to hear literally school to school as to how they want to articulate this. And yeah, I have some real concerns as to the level of activity that we're going to be able to see for some of those sports and really some of those related activities, because not just the band, there's a lot of other things that sort of also feed off of football, particularly in terms of community groups and charitable groups and fundraisers and all of that sort of gathering. There's a lot of stuff that feeds off of that. And so it's a good question, and I don't have a clear answer, because you really hit it on the head that it's one thing for a multi-billion-dollar professional national sports entity, to take these guys, put them in a bubble. We just don't have those resources here.
Eric, I have a question.
Yeah.
In the chat, we've got someone here who has tickets for U.S. Tennis Open.
Eric, hello, that's me.
Oh, do you want to go ahead and ask him that question then, Ed?
Right. Yeah, we've had issues with the U.S. Open. They wanted us to sign a waiver about the tickets that, if we cancel, they're letting us cancel, but they want to sign a waiver that we will not get seats for this year and most likely all future U.S. Opens. We refuse to sign it and turn it over to the Attorney General for New York State. What's your position? What do you think is going to happen with the U.S. Open? They're obviously not going to let 35,000 fans on the grounds because there's no way you can social distance there.
Yeah, I think at best we're looking at a modified situation. But and this has been something that on the other sports I've been dealing with as well, that where particularly baseball, given the tonnage of games that they've lost, because they've lost by far the most of them, but even hockey and basketball has done some stuff with the lost games that they had at the end of 2020, where they really encouraged you could get your refund if you wanted it.
Well, I never paid the bill. They just credited it off the account.
Right. What they really want you to do is roll forward. And so what I would really hope is that the U.S. Open would try to find some way to take care of you, that like it would almost seem like they would want volunteers to help space things out for 2020, that like, listen, if you don't come to 2020, we're really going to take care of you in 2021, because that's what everybody else is doing. They're basically saying, if you don't feel comfortable coming this year, please come next year and we'll actually give you financial incentives to do so. And I'm a little chagrined to hear, I hadn't quite gotten to that granular level specifically with the Open tickets. I'm chagrined to hear that, because basically they should be incentivizing volunteers, because I agree with you that at best we're looking at a half to 2/3 full kind of situation.
I doubt it will be that. Do you have an email I could send you the information, what they sent to us? I could. Yeah,
so eric.fisher@sportbusiness.com, SPORT.
Eric.Fisher
at sportbusiness.com.
At sportsbusiness.com.
Yeah, because quite frankly, my position on this is that they should be actually soliciting and incentivizing volunteers to just roll over to future years, because then that empties the building for this year. Because let's be honest, I mean, I don't know how good your tickets are, but
we have handicapped seats in the 300 level, like that ring around there where they have folding chairs. That's what we say.
Okay, I mean, yeah, it's a great place to watch tennis, particularly on a nice summer night. But the point I'm making is that the suite holders and the higher price stuff lower, those are the folks that are they spent the most. They're the ones that they're going to prioritize. Let's just be honest about that. Yeah. And so for everybody else in the building, where I would have liked to have seen is you being sort of offered a carrot to help them out and help yourself out at the same time. And what I'm hearing is much more of a stick. And that's
I'll email it to you, the documents I got, and then you'll understand. And I'm just waiting. There's supposed to be an announcement by end of this week whether they're going to have it or what they're going to do.
Well, and part of the confusion on this, and I didn't get into all the machinations, that right now the lean is to be back at Flushing Meadows, but there was a period of time a few weeks back, particularly when the New York numbers were much higher, where they're like, are we even going to do this in Flushing Meadows? And they were looking at Indian Wells in California and some other facilities and literally not even having it in this part of the country. And so, it's been moved from various things as to, are we going to have it? Are we going to have it on these dates? Are we even going to have it in Queens? A lot of moving pieces. And now where they seem to be going is, yes, Queens, yes, same timetable. But as I mentioned, are they even going to be able to get all the top foreign players? And so, unfortunately, and I'm not excusing anything, but that just, all of these things just push the ticket issue further down the list.
Yeah, I know they've had proposals, how they would bring the European players in, the South American players in, by charter flights. I've seen various things. I also do high school officiating of tennis,
So just in the interest of
Thanks
time,
very
it's a good
Thanks very
conversation,
much,
but I know
Vincent.
we've got John waiting to ask a question as well.
Thanks
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you. Can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yes.
Eric, we're talking so much about Major League Baseball that it seems to me we've forgotten about minor league baseball and independent league baseball. It seems to me that Major League Baseball is going to back in to getting rid of 40 affiliated cities and who knows how many more.
Yep.
And the sport of independent, I work in the independent league, fannies in the seats. That's a driving force for those guys in order to pay their bills. Money doesn't come from too many other places.
Yeah, I've written about this, and they don't have national media contracts, and minor league baseball, they're just beginning to build out a national sponsorship business, but they still get the vast majority, 75-80% of their overall revenues from gate revenue. Independent leagues even more, and so they're in real dire straits, and these are very small businesses, and we've had a lot of instances of layoffs and furloughs and those kinds of things. And really what we're looking at, and I'll address the PBA negotiations in a second, but your point is very taken, because it's very strong likelihood, given that they really need attending fans to pay the bills. It actually would be a big time money loser to open the gates and play games. So right now, if I had to guess, we're not going to have a 2020 minor league baseball season, affiliated or independent.
And my concern is, how deep are the pockets? I mean, if you look at the Atlantic League, it seems to me that Somerset and Long Island right now are about the only two franchises that perhaps might survive this year without playing. But I think the others are small, really small markets, and they've been in trouble financially for a number of years anyway. And I just wonder what's going to happen to up at Yogi Berra Stadium with the Jackals, and out there in Sussex. I mean, we could see minor league independent baseball just disappear from the state of New Jersey.
Well, and the losses are going to be pronounced on the affiliated side as well.
Yeah.
Before the pandemic hit, just for the benefit of everybody, where minor league baseball is, where the affiliated, where there's affiliated and independent, and the affiliated teams, those players are actually in the major league parent club's system and are funneling up to those parent organizations. Independent is just as the name suggests, and they are not directly tied to a major league parent. Every 10 years, Major League Baseball and the affiliated minor league baseball, they do a master agreement to sort of govern their working relationship. We're at that point now, because it's every 10 years, it's much just like the census. We're at that point now where they're negotiating that again. And well before the pandemic hit, Major League Baseball, for a variety of reasons, which really could be its own separate program, I won't get into everything, but they're trying to dramatically reduce the number of teams, go down from 160 to 120, and do a vast geographic realignment of the leagues, and do a bunch of wholesale changes that really kind of change the dynamic fabric of Major League or minor league baseball as we know it. over the fall and winter, minor league baseball was fighting this tooth and nail, and they had Congress engaged, they had mayors engaged, and it was pretty ugly. What the pandemic has done, because these teams are such small businesses and they're hurting for cash so badly, and they're going to basically lose an entire year of revenue, they're now crawling back, unfortunately, to Major League Baseball and having to essentially do the negotiation over again on MLB's terms. And so some teams are just naturally going to die out. Some will be sort of forced out because of this. And we're just ultimately going to be left with a smaller, less vibrant situation. And the important thing to remember, again, I deal with all these sports, and what I hear to a man across the entire industry, all these properties, all these leagues, they want to get more grassroots and they want to do better with families and children. Every single one of them. And nobody does better grassroots marketing and does better with families and children than minor league baseball, affiliated and independent. And baseball, again, for its own reasons, are voluntarily walking back away from that. And I don't understand it.
I don't either.
And what the pandemic has done is it's accelerated a lot of business trends well beyond just sports, across all of business and industry. A lot of things that were already fermenting and happening are now being pushed forward at greater speed. And unfortunately, the diminution of minor league baseball is one of those things that's now being pushed forward at greater speed.
Who's to sign it?
Okay, so we don't have any more questions in the chat, but I will, oh, I see someone's hand up. Hang on, I'm gonna mute myself and unmute.
Hi there. Hey,
Hello?
hi. Yeah, our family is into horsepower. That means equestrian sports and motorsports. And we could have a great discussion about how Formula One's going to make their thing happen, and IndyCar got started. But on the equestrian side, can you speak to what's happening with equestrian sports?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually got some had some notes on that, and I forgot to get to it because I got too involved in baseball. But basically what's happening is they basically sort of inverted the Triple Crown schedule. The Belmont is going to still happen in this very modified format, much like the other events coming back online. But the other two legs of the Triple Crown, Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, they've been moved to the fall. The Kentucky Derby and the Preakness will happen in September and October. So they've had to recalibrate their schedule as well. And it's going to be the same sort of thing where these events will happen with little to no fans, and that kind of pageantry and the infield and the mint juleps and all this sort of stuff that, like, these horse races are less than 2 minutes. Like the horse race, and I don't have to tell you being a fan that, like, the day and the fan experience, that's really the race is almost sort of a conduit to this other thing that's so majestic and people love so much that the race itself just sort of sits as a foundation. But under the sort of the new protocols, for obvious reasons, the race is just going to be sort of the race itself. It's really going to be into next year in 2022 before we sort of get back to normal. But the idea is for those races and the smaller tracks are starting to come online under the same sort of limited rules as well. But again, so much of horse racing is about kind of the hanging around and the being with your family and friends and those that you came with and all of that. And that's sort of what's been lost. It's sort of almost a modified version of tailgating or what have you. And, unfortunately, that's another sort of loss through this whole thing. But yeah, the idea is to have horse racing sort of come back under these same sort of modifications, but with a inverted schedule that'll sort of look a little bit like golf, where the things that should have been happening in the spring are going to happen in the fall.
The equestrian sports like eventing and the show jumping and dressage.
Did you hear that?
Okay, so not just the racing, but
Right, that was a great start on that. But yeah, then there's the other stuff. That's the
sure. honestly, I have not paid as much attention to that, because where sort of my sort of day-to-day business focus has been, particularly with the Triple Crown and things that sort of directly feed into the Triple Crown. But my loose understanding is it's the same basic deal, that where springtime events we're moved to the fall in the hopes of being able to stage at least a modified version in the fall. And if there wasn't room on the calendar, just outright cancellation. And that ostensibly was what killed off Wimbledon, that as they were aligning that in tennis, as they were realigning the calendar, they just couldn't make the calendar work. And so there may have been some losses because of that. But my understanding is similar to the other horse racing events, is to be able to do this with the same sort of health and safety protocols, where you have more limited operational personnel, more limited broadcast personnel for the television coverage, all that sort of thing. The good news is that a lot of these are socially distanced sports, so you're not dealing with some of the inherent competitive issues that you would in some of the other sports.
Could I just do a quick follow-up?
Sure.
On the Belmont, what's the reason, do you know, for reducing it from 1.5 miles to 1.1 miles? Because do we really have the Triple Crown this year?
I'll take the last one first.
Yep.
Probably not. And you raise an interesting question that we're having to wrestle with in all of the sports, that do any of these champions in these revised leagues, are they really champions? And we don't really have a clear answer to that. And even some of the players involved, and again, I even heard this today in baseball, that like, if we have a 50-game season, is a World Series champion really a World Series champion? To directly answer your question, that was a training issue, because we haven't had the spring run-up events. The Belmont being at the end with that longer race, because we already had the other 2 legs of the Triple Crown, because we had feeder races leading up to that. The horses were just literally in game shape to be able to handle that increased distance. But by putting that longer distance first, just tailing that back, that was just a salve to the animals, just to be a little bit more humane and not push them at that increased distance right off the gate.
Thank you.
So I had a question. As you were talking about the various sports, this is more sort of game adjacent. Could you talk a little bit about what the various halls of fame are going to be doing this year? I know it would have been, July or August that Cooperstown would have had inductions. What's happening with any of that, if anything?
So yeah, glad you brought that up. Cooperstown, they are not having 2020. So Derek Jeter and Larry Walker and that whole class, they're literally just going to be bolted onto whoever gets inducted in 2021, and it would just be a larger ceremony. And same sort of thing, where it's similar to the Olympics, where they toyed around with different models, different times of the year, but where they landed is just going back to, because the nature of the event was so fundamental to the thing in and of itself, doing it in any other way and in any other time of the year just didn't seem right. So Cooperstown is going to literally do the same thing next year. Similar idea for the Little League World Series, but that's not really what you asked. Pro Football Hall of Fame, similar sort of thing, where it's a little bit different there, though, that they're going to still have the Hall of Fame game, because that's going to be the kickoff for the exhibition season. But the idea is to not have their usual induction there either, for all the obvious reasons, because it just so much of that, much like what we were talking about with the horse racing and some of the other events, it's about the gathering and having all those family and friends there. And if you can't have that in the same way, it's best just to put off the induction ceremony. But Pro Football Hall of Fame is still looking to do the Hall of Fame game. But yeah, Derek Jeter is going to have to wait a full year for his induction.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question for Eric before we wrap things up?
I thought of one more thing.
Sure.
Financial side, your list of sports that are on the verge of bankruptcy, aside from the discussed minor league baseball?
So there are a lot of entities. Like we've got 3 different lacrosse leagues. Are 3 different lacrosse leagues going to survive through this whole thing? Maybe not. There's a couple of surfing entities out there. Are each of them going to survive? Not necessarily. There are multiple tiers of pro soccer in this country below Major League Soccer. USL, the USL in and of itself has multiple levels. Team level foldings would be the first sort of wave of this, but could we see wholesale entities go out? For sure. And it's going to be at that similar level of the food chain as minor league baseball is, that these entities that don't have the large scale media contracts to help them keep them afloat. We talked about the baseball fight. We talked about the other major leagues trying to get back going. What's really helping to continue the freight on all of those big time entities are the media contracts, because not only were they huge contracts to begin with, but the demand for their content is only going up. And again, I talked about acceleration of trends, that these things were already the last remnant of live television that anybody watches to begin with. But what we've seen during this whole pandemic period is that any piece of original or fresh sports content, ratings through the roof. Last Dance documentary, the NFL draft, the WNBA draft, the Major League Baseball draft, the Tiger Phil event, any of this fresh content, ratings through the roof. And it's this media money that is continuing to keep those guys going when nobody's able to buy a ticket. But for those entities at the lower levels that don't have those media contracts and really do rely on that gate revenue and butts and seats to make it work, all of those entities are at some level of risk, because they don't have those media dollars to help carry them through this period.
Okay. If there are no other questions, then just want to thank you all for coming. I want to especially thank Eric for making some time to chat with all of us. I do want to remind our patrons that our book drop is open. So as we are preparing for the next phase, we invite you to return anything you borrowed from Scotch Plains Library can be returned to our book drop at any time. So the more materials we get back, once we're able to start lending print materials out, the more we will have available. We quarantine materials for 7 days. So we just, as things get returned, then we can start that turnaround process on our end. So we welcome you to do that. So again, just thank everybody for coming. We hope you had, got some good information from this. Keep an eye on our website and on Facebook. We're continuing to try and bring you a lot of great programs, and we would love to see you again soon. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Eric. It's great.
Take care. Thanks.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.